Morris. Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, and via your smart speaker. Henry Bonsu on Times Radio.
Yeah, we talked about climate change and global warming, or global heating, as they say these days. Well, let's talk about the shifting sands of the Energy Secretary, Ed Miliband, and his position on matters of oil and gas and drilling. Apparently, he has moved to unblock the development of two controversial new oil and gas fields in the North Sea, setting out new criteria under which the projects can be approved. The Energy Secretary has published legal guidance that will allow the owners of Rosebank oil field near Shetland and Shell's Jackdaw gas field near Aberdeen to apply for permission to start drilling. Now, the two projects had been given the go-ahead under the previous government, but were blocked by the courts after environmentalists successfully challenged their oil and gas production licences. So, to drill or not to drill? Is it a question of drill, baby, drill? Well, that's what we're going to discuss tonight. I was joined a short time ago by Tessa Khan, the founder and director of Uplift, which is an organisation that wants us to transition away from oil and gas production, and Nathaniel Ogunniyi, a political commentator with Young Voices UK. And I began with Tessa and asked her what it would mean symbolically if we started drilling anew.
I spent a number of hours today poring over this new guidance that the government has published on how it will assess from now on the environmental impacts of new oil and gas fields. And I have to say that there is absolutely nothing in that guidance that suggests that the Rosebank oil field will be approved by the Secretary of State, Ed Miliband. What this guidance actually does is really put front and centre the fact that anyone who assesses these projects has to, for the first time, take into account the biggest environmental harm flowing from these projects, which is the climate impact of burning the oil and sometimes gas that these fields contain. And you know, we know that the science is very clear that in a trajectory in which we stay below 1.5 degrees of warming, which is widely recognised to be a safe threshold for climate change. And I'm sure anyone in the UK today, given the heat waves, the drought that we've entered into parts of this country, the driest spring on record, you know, recognises we're already in a danger zone, and the science is clear that there isn't room for new oil and gas fields. And I actually think that this new guidance is a recognition of the need to take into account those climate impacts.
Interesting what you say, Tessa, because not everybody is interpreting the updating of the guidance in that way. Nathaniel, what do you take from it? Because some people say, well, this is good because it's essentially a reality check. We need this new oil, we need this new gas drilling and exploration in our waters.
Yeah, so I think there are two main parts to this story. The first is that we should be avoiding lawfare where at all possible. So if there are political decisions over whether we want to drill for oil and gas, if there are decisions that we want to make about social policy in other areas, then those should be made by our elected politicians. We have 650 MPs sitting in Parliament, we have peers in the Lords, and they should be making the decisions about what policies we put forward in this country rather than courts. Courts should be interpreting the law rather than making policy decisions. But specifically when it comes to this oil and gas new guidance, I think the guidance provides clarity for the sector. Oil and gas pumps billions into our economy. You know, the 25 billion, I think, is the figure that the industry tell you. They provide about 9 billion in tax. So I think oil and gas supports our economy, and any guidance that provides clarity for the sector and that clarity that can lead to investment is obviously a good thing.
But Nathaniel, as is being reported today, if these schemes get the green light, there would be a significant impact on our climate change emanating from this country. I mean, Rosebank would release something like 130 million tonnes of CO2 during its lifetime, and Jackdaw would add something like 32 million tonnes on top of what we already emit. How alarmed would you be about that and the difficulty it would imply on our achieving net zero by 2050?
So I think both those projects are totally compatible with net zero. Net zero isn't about an overnight ban on oil and gas production or extraction. It's about making an orderly transition by 2050, and that's totally compatible with this policy. So producing oil and gas domestically, so producing it in this country rather than importing perhaps LNG from the US or Qatar, is much more environmentally sustainable. North Sea gas is 4 times cleaner than LNG imports coming from other countries. That's an official government statistic. So the government recognised that using our own oil and gas is good for our energy security and it's compatible with net zero.
How would you respond to that, Tessa?
Yes, I'd quite like to respond to that. Look, the first thing to say is that not saying yes to new oil and gas fields like Rosebank is entirely compatible with having a managed transition for the North Sea. And that's for 2 reasons. The first is that the North Sea is a basin that is already in decline. It is past its best years many decades ago. And that's why, actually, about 200,000 jobs supported by that sector have already been lost in the last decade, despite hundreds of new licenses being issued to drill for oil and gas. And in fact, we will have hundreds of oil and gas fields. Even if we don't approve a single new field, we'll have hundreds of existing fields that continue to produce oil and gas in the UK for years to come. So no one is talking about turning off the taps, even if you don't approve Rosebank. The other thing that I think it's extremely important to be clear about is that most of what's left in the North Sea, more than 70%, is oil. And we export 80% of what we produce. So we are not displacing imports. This is not about our gas being cleaner than gas that we might import instead. In fact, there's only about 4 days worth of gas a year left in the North Sea if we were to drill it all, which we won't because it's not all commercially viable. So that's completely misleading to make that comparison when, as I said, most of this stuff is for export. It is not displacing imports. And just finally, I'd make the observation that far from being a massive economic contributor to the UK, the oil and gas industry has benefited from some of the most generous tax breaks in the world. So currently, for an oil field like Rosebank, the UK public would effectively cover more than 80% of the costs of developing that field. There have actually been years when the oil price has fallen, when the tax take has been negative from that sector. In fact, 2 such years just in the last 10 years, when the Exchequer has to pay out more to the oil and gas industry than it brings in. And as the government has itself admitted, more North Sea oil and gas drilling won't bring down the price of oil and gas that we consume in this country. And that is what is on people's minds at the moment. It's the fact that they can't afford their household energy bills. The prices at the pump are also going up, and more North Sea drilling won't do anything to address that concern.
So, Nathaniel, far from being a source of energy security, and indeed perhaps for some people, national pride, this is a subsidised industry that is actually a drain on the taxpayer, as opposed to being something we can rely on, as opposed to the usual problems with the volatile international markets.
Not quite. So the government themselves admit that the sector pays about $9 billion in revenue, or gives it about $9 billion in revenue every single year, right? Those are official government statistics, so I suppose you'd have to take that up with them. But the sector pays an over 70% rate of tax on its profits. It pays some of the highest tax in the UK compared to any other country. So, of course, the commercial operation of oil and gas in this country is incredibly important to our economy. And it's important to the 150 or so thousand people that still work offshore in the UK, right? Try telling them that their jobs aren't important. So I think it's important for us to recognise that the commercial investments that these companies make in the UK support jobs in the UK, pay tax in the UK, employ people in the UK. And that's an important thing for us to note. And then I suppose when it comes more broadly to energy security, I go, sure, we do have some exports of energy. It would be great, actually, I think, if we had greater or indeed more exports of energy. But the
more we export our energy, the less we can actually use here domestically.
So, I mean, we should be extracting more energy overall, right? And so when we extract more, we can use more domestically and we can export more, right? Whether the energy is used domestically or exported, it is still good for our economy. It still supports families here. It still supports investment here. It still supports tax revenue here, right? And that tax revenue is desperately needed. So every time you think, oh, what a shame that this pothole hasn't been repaired, or what a shame, I'd have loved a new A&E wing on this hospital, you know, tax revenue has to come from somewhere. And I think getting it from oil and gas companies in a sustainable way that supports them to make investment here is really important.
Mm-hmm. Tessa, the government claims that the Energy Secretary is going to make decisions on a case-by-case basis. How confident are you that he will hold the line, that he is committed to this, and that he won't be swayed by the politics as some activists fear?
Well, look, I think, when it comes to a field like Rosebank, it's the biggest undeveloped oil field in the UK. The government's just set itself a very robust climate test for the approval of those new fields. So I think we can feel quite confident that the government is going to take those obligations seriously. And I think, that the piece that's often missing from these conversations when we talk about the economics, and I have to say, I think Nathaniel's really misrepresented the role that the UK oil and gas sector plays in our economy on multiple levels. But, there are two things that we forget. One is the impacts of climate change that are costing, for example, our farmers many hundreds of millions of dollars, many hundreds of millions of pounds. We're having to pay out billions of pounds each year in increased flood defences. These are real costs. These are people's real homes, real livelihoods that are being affected right now. So that's very important to keep in mind. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that the UK government at the moment is investing in making sure that we have a booming renewable energy sector that will provide tens of thousands more jobs than are directly supported by the oil and gas sector in the years to come. In just the last couple of days, they've made a new announcement about billions of pounds being invested in the supply chains that will make sure that we manufacture the wind turbine technology here in the UK so that those communities and those people who have relied on oil and gas jobs in the past, but as I said, are in an increasingly precarious position just because those reserves are declining as a matter of geological reality, that those people are taken care of. And that's what the government needs to focus on. That is the route to energy independence. That is the route to getting us away from being at the whim of international fossil fuel markets. And the latest war in the Middle East is yet another example of why we need that independence. And the only resources we have in the UK that can provide that independence are renewable energy resources, which we happen to be incredibly lucky to have some of the best in Europe.
So, Nathaniel, finally, instead of clinging to what appears to be a glimmer of hope in this updated advice, this so-called framework, you and those who believe that there's still a good long-term robust future in new oil and gas drilling need to get with the programme. Get real. There is a just energy transition afoot and you need to embrace it.
Well, we're happy to see an energy transition, at least certainly I am. But as I say, net zero isn't about an overnight ban. So a transition can happen and is indeed compatible with more exploration in the North Sea. North Sea barrels don't come with foreign strings attached. And so it's better for us to use our own supply, use our own oil, use our own gas, and employ our own people while we're at it.
Very interesting discussion there on the future of oil and gas drilling in the North Sea. I spoke to Nathaniel Ogunniyi, who's a political commentator with Young Voices UK, and Tessa Khan, the founder and director of Uplift. Your thoughts, please.